Hey everyone, Kevin Marks here from Fast Tracks, and tonight this is another episode of Upstairs in the Workshop, Volume 4, Part 2. We're going to finish soldering this up tonight. We were working on this last time, and we're going to finish this up, and we're going to do some soldering outside of the fixture. So I just want to do this live. I think there's a value in having this presented live so you can see exactly what we do. So if this is your first time to Upstairs in the Workshop, it's basically a casual clinic. There's really not a strict agenda, but what I want to do is show you some cool stuff that we're working on and just kind of walk you through it. So the whole idea is if you were to come over and I was going to walk you through a project, this is what we're going to do. So pull up a chair, get a beverage, relax, and we're going to go through this. So the last video, I was working on a quad crossing, and this is what we finished, and it's pretty cool. And my initial plan was going to make it into a quad crossing, but I found some new pictures and found out that it wasn't a 45-degree crossing. So we're just going to finish it into a double crossing and create a new quad crossing. So what I was trying to replicate was this right here, and as you can see, it looks very much like a 45-degree crossing. But I was on the website historicaerials.com, which is a great website. If you want to do some virtual rail fanning, you can literally just type in a location and then you can choose a year and it will take you to all the aerial photographs from that era. So I was on that website and I found this guy, and these two, I'm doing this backwards, so these lines right here over this way are actually the crossing. So I thought that's definitely not a 45-degree crossing. So what I did do, I have a 18-degree crossing here, and keep in mind this is O scale. So I just kind of laid everything, and I'm doing this backwards, so bear with me. So I kind of laid everything up and everything matched just fine. So we're going to end up using the double 45 in another location and then build a quad 18-degree crossing, which is pretty cool. So just to give you an idea, this is O scale on how big a quad 18-degree crossing is. I worked on this last weekend, so here it is. Check that out. Yeah, so this is basically 35 inches long, and everything that's in red is what I'm going to build in the fixture. And if it's not in red, I'm going to build that outside of the fixture, which is kind of what we're doing tonight. So the same principles applied. So we're going to cover some basic soldering techniques. We're going to use the American Beauty single point electrode resistance iron, which is a great tool, especially in O scale when you need a little more horsepower. And we're going to dial that up to 85 watts. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to add some of the additional ties around here, around the ends of the crossing. We're going to add that. And then when you look at it close, you can kind of see on this side, there are some guardrails that are missing, and then down in here too. So we're going to finish those up and add those guardrails in. So what we're going to do tonight is outside of the fixture. So once you do enough of these, you kind of, build up your confidence, and I want you to build up your confidence as well too in soldering, and you can build track work. You don't need a fixture for everything. You can use it to get it started, and then if you need something special, you can finish it outside of the fixture. So we're going to cover that tonight. So we're pretty excited that we can finally finish this bad boy up and get it on a module. So I kind of did all the prep work ahead of time, but I'm going to walk you through what I did so you can see it. And from the last video, I changed the workshop around so we have a much better camera angle, and you'll be able to see a lot closer up what exactly is going on. So we're going to cover some basic soldering techniques and just kind of walk you through everything and get rolling on everything. So I have everything. I just need this little guy, and You can't forget safety glasses. Anytime you're doing anything, you need to have some safety glasses on, and you never know when a piece of metal is going to fly up, and you need to protect those eyes. And for those following along at home who've seen the last videos, the fire extinguisher is right down there. It's always good to have one of those. Not that I plan on using it, but it's always good to have one whenever you do some work. So let's get started, and I'm going to move the camera angle down a little bit, and I'm going to do all of this right in front of you so you can see exactly what's going to happen tonight. So we're going to do a little bit of prep work, and then we're going to put the ties down, get those soldered in, and then we're going to solder in the guardrails, and that should do it. And we should be just fine. So here's the workbench. So I'm going to try to keep this camera angle the entire night, so that way you can see exactly what's going on here. So here's our work, and the thing that you have to do when you solder is make sure everything is absolutely clean. You've probably heard me in some of the previous NMRA X videos where I said if it's not shiny, don't solder it. So the first thing we're going to do is take off some of the oxidation from when we last worked on it. So I have some 400 grit sandpaper, and I'm just hitting the bottoms of the rails. Those need to be shiny. We need the solder to adhere to those locations. And on this side, I got to get that guardrail too. And we're just going to clean everything up. The other advantage of using a 400 grit is you're slightly etching the material as well too, and that gives the solder a little better bite, that you can get a cleaner joint and a much stronger joint, and you don't need as much solder. And as you're going to see in just a little bit, the soldering is going to go really easy, really fast, and things should turn out really well tonight. So the other thing that I like doing, that I already did before I even started, is take your Dremel tool and get one of those steel wire brushes and clean off all the lubricant that's on your rail. You'd be amazed at how dirty brand new rail is, and it's covered with a film, and you need to get that film off before you even start. So this is always a good thing to do before you even start cutting up rail. Is, I got my Dremel here, so this is what I'm talking about, and that steel wire wheel does a great job in cleaning off all that oxidation and all the lubricant from pushing the rail through the die. So that's looking good. So the bottoms of the rail are looking good, and we're going to let's just start up on let's do this side first. So we're going to take our ties. I already cut the PC ties. These are the copperhead ties that we sell. I already cut those to length, and then it's vital to get the oxidation off on what you're working on. So we're just going to clean up these ties, and you'll also notice I'm wearing black nitrile gloves. Just like painting, you want everything to be absolutely clean, and you don't want any oils from your fingers to get on your soldering. So let's just give these a quick little swipe. And I like doing this immediately before we start to solder. That way you know there's no oxidation on what you're doing. So let's just slide these in real quick. Just give it a quick little test to make sure that everything is looking good. So as you can see, we have these little loose pieces right here, and we need to keep those straight. So I'm going to show you a little trick that's real easy to do. But the first thing I'm going to do is take my scribe, just using one of these, and just going to mark where the rail is going to go. So when I put flux down, I have an idea of where to put the flux. So we're just going to do a quick little scribe on the PC ties, just so I have an idea of where that flux is going to go. So now that we did that, let me grab my flux. So the other thing I want to say is, if you're having any issues soldering, you need to do a couple things. One, you need to make sure you have the right kind of flux, and this is just the acid-based flux that we sell. Little tub goes a long way. It's a little bit stronger of a flux than a water-based flux, and it helps you solder up some very robust track work that is going to give you good service for years to come. So I'm just putting a little bit of that on the ties from where my scribe lines went, and then we're going to slide these back in, and I'm just going to do one of these first. So here's the little trick on lining up your ties. So I'm going to take an extra long PC tie, and I'm going to slide that right next to it and kind of use that as a guide to make sure that that tie, and you can see it right there, is in place where it needs to be. So the other videos, I showed you these little 1, 2, 3 machinist blocks, and these things weigh a couple pounds, and they're fantastic for soldering. So I'm just going to put a couple of these around just to make sure that nothing of what we're going to do is going to move, and that is looking nice and strong. And I might even, nope, that's not going to work. I'm just going to leave that the way it is, and I think we'll be good. So when you are using the resistance iron, and again, here is the American Beauty resistance iron. Get that, doing things backwards here in the camera. So that's a single point electrode, which is very fine, and it gets you in some really tight spots in your track work. And if you're using code 125 or code 148, it's vital. So then what you have to do too is hook up this little alligator clip to the rail, and basically all we're doing is creating an electrical circuit, and where that circuit gets interrupted is when the joint or the iron will generate heat on that joint, so you can get a lot of heat very quickly. So now I'm just going to put a little bit of of flux on the tie and the base of the rail, because we want that solder to flow underneath. So the other thing I'm using is an optivisor. Being able to see your work makes all the difference in the world. And we're ready to solder. So there's a little foot pedal underneath the desk, and when I hit the foot pedal, the joint will heat up extremely quickly. So the other thing that you should do is, trying to get this in the frame here, is use very, very thin solder, same solder that we saw on the website, where it will keep that joint looking nice and clean, just because you aren't putting a whole lot of solder on it. So what I'm going to do, and this is soldering 101, is you want to heat up the material and apply solder to the other side, just like what we're doing. So I have the iron on the outside of the rail, and I'm going to apply solder on the inside of the rail, and then it'll flow underneath to the other side. And if you ever see globs of solder on your tie, that means that either the joint's not cleaned properly, or you're heating the tie and not the rail. You always want to have the material melt the solder, not the piece that you're touching, so that way you can ensure a good clean joint. So I hit the foot pedal, there's a little bit of smoke, there's a little bit of a hum, things are looking really good, and all I'm going to do is swipe the solder. That one little swipe was all it took. and the solder flowed underneath, came out the other side. It's nice and shiny, and it's just that easy. That's a good joint. So now we're going to do the other side. And I hit the foot pedal, and there's a little bit of solder smoke, which is okay. And that one is looking pretty good. I bumped the table there for a second, and a little bit of solder got on the tie. So the other thing that I like using is this solder wick, which is just some copper braid with some flux. And if you do find that you put a little too much on, you can just use that, heat it up, and take it right off. And that's looking really good, and kind of clean up your work. So now we're going to take that tie out and move on to the next one. So let me just unhook all of this. And we just pop that right off, and we're good to go. So a little bit of the solder got on it, but that's okay, since we're just throwing that away anyway. So now we're going to go on to the next one, and we're just going to line things up again, and we're going to put our tie right where it needs to be. Let's get a different one right there. And we'll get it lined up, and that is looking really, really good. So let's put our weights back down again. Just going to make a fine little adjustment right here. It's always good to check your work once more right before you solder it. And that could save you a little bit of hassle. Sometimes when you start soldering, you're pretty excited to do it, and you just kind of jump in. But the key with good soldering is slow down, take your time, double check everything, use some weights. So now I'm just going to put a little bit of flux on that piece. Of course, I just moved it while I was doing that. So we're just going to take our scribe and pop that back into place. And that is looking really, really good. So what I'm going to do now is slide the tie that we used for alignment kind of out of the way, and we're ready to solder. So again, you put the heat on one side, and then you apply solder to the other side. So I unhook the electrode. So let's clip that back on, and we'll give it another go. So the joint heats up extremely fast, and then while I do this, I like to swipe the solder a little bit rather than putting it straight on. Then I can control the amount of solder that goes on that joint. So now we're going to do the other side, and I just switched hands. So if you do this long enough, you get used to soldering with both hands, because I want, if there's any excess flux, I want it to be on the inside of the rail. So we're just going to touch it ever so slightly, take the heat off, and notice I'm still holding the iron while the joint is cooling. You never want to move the iron too quickly, otherwise things will go. So this is what we did. Try to get this in the light right here. So we just added these two ties right here. So now we're going to move on and we're going to do this side right here. And then there's just a couple other really long ones on the other side, and we'll get that done. So thanks for sticking along with me tonight while I do this, and hopefully you get some value out of it. It's always good to see things being done live, and we always want you to know with our products there's no surprises. What you see is what you get, and if you follow along, things go pretty easy. So what we're doing now is we're just taking some 400 grit and we're sanding off the tops of the ties. I actually did this the other night, and I'm amazed that even 2 days later how much oxidation goes back on the tie even after it was cleaned just 48 hours ago. So you always want to get that off, get that looking nice and shiny. That's looking fantastic, and it doesn't take too long. So there we go. So what we're going to do is follow the same thing we did before. Get some more light in here so you can see what we're doing a little bit better. And again, I'm going to slide the ties in, and then I'm going to scribe where the rail is, so then when I add flux, I know exactly where to go. So now that I did that, I'm just going to put a little weight on there, hold it in place, and we're just going to just make a little mark. Super, super easy. That one's done. And come back and do this one. That one's good. And the last one, just like that. So I'm just making a little scribe mark. This is an extra step, but I also don't like getting flux anywhere that I don't need it. So that's why we're doing it. So then it doesn't really become an extra step if it helps your project. But I think it's one of those things that sometimes gets overlooked. So we're just going through real quick, putting some acid-based flux on it. Then we'll slide them back under the rails and we'll get them soldered up, and that side will be done as well. So let's slide this one back in, and then I'm just going to put a long tie in there for alignment. Make sure that everything looks nice and straight. That's looking good. And now I'm going to put some flux along the rails on the tie. That's looking real nice. I'm going to add a little more weight to it. Hold it in place. I'm going to slide that down just a little bit. Check my alignment, and we're good to go. So now we can start soldering again. Hook up the electrode, grab my solder, and let's do this. So I'm actually going to put the electrode inside the guardrail, and I'm just going to touch the guardrail real quick. I'm going to do the other side. Just going to kind of tack it in place first, like that. And then I'm going to slide that tie that we use for alignment, get that out of there, and then come back and finish the joint up. Otherwise, you may solder that tie to it, which we kind of did that first time. So I'm just adding just a tiny little bit of solder. It's flowing under the rail really nice. You come back and touch that one again. Add just a tiny bit more to this one. Switch hands real quick. That's a skill that's good to learn, so you don't have to keep flipping your work around. And it's easy with the resistance iron. That looked really good. I got a little bit on the rail over here, so I'm just going to clean that up with the soldering wick. And all I'm doing is moving it a little bit back and forth. And we're good to go. So there's one tie down. Now we're going to move on to the next one and repeat that process. So I'm just going to slide the next one underneath. There's flux on it already. And then I'm going to add that other piece of tie material in, just for alignment purposes, so we can make sure that that tie lines up with all the other ones. That's looking really nice. So now we're going to come back and put some flux on it, or just touch flux to the outside of the rail. Get the inside of that guardrail a little bit too. So that's looking good. Check our alignment once again. That's looking really, really nice. The weight's in the right spot. Our electrode is on. So now we can solder this up. So I'm holding the tip of the iron to the outside of the base of the rail. Turns red hot, and literally I swiped it once, and that's it. And some of the solder flowed under the rail, came out the other side, made a nice solder joint, and the solder settled in the etching from the sandpaper, and that gives the joint a little more bite. So now we're doing the other side, and I'm just going to touch it a little bit, take the heat off, and now I'm going to move out that tie so we don't accidentally solder it to our work, and then come back and finish up that guardrail. So I'm going to switch hands again so I can tack down this guardrail, and this will go super quick. There we go. Guess I need some more help soldering with my other hand. I got the joint turned out great. I just got a little bit on the rail, and we're just going to clean that up, and that's looking really good. So that is done. So this is what we just did right here. We just soldered these pieces into the crossing, and that goes pretty easy and fast. And actually, we've got one more to do. Can't celebrate just yet, but at least wanted to give you a close-up in case you're tuning in right now for the first time. So we're going to slide this last tie in, and the flux is already underneath it. We're going to add a little bit of weight on here and then slide in that other tie. Make sure it's aligned, looking really nice. I'm happy with that. So just like before, we're going to add a little bit of flux to each side of the rail. So we want the flux to flow underneath, come out the other side, and then grab the base of the rail. Easy peasy. So we're going to check our alignment once again. That's looking good. Everything is right where it needs to be. Add a little bit of weight. The electrode's hooked up, and let's tack this one down. So we got 85 watts dialed in. Just a little swipe of the solder, that's all it takes. And then do the other side real quick. That's looking really good. So we can take that off, pop out that tie, and there we go. This side is finished. So you can kind of get a little close up of some of the solder joints. There's a little carbon buildup on one of those, but the wire brush will take care of that real quick. That's looking really sharp. So now we're going to do these pieces right here. I think I'm going to flip this closer to me. You never want soldering to be hard. You shouldn't have to reach over what you're doing. So we're going to take care of this side right here. Let's see if we can get that camera up. Move that just a little bit. So we've got our two pieces of rail, and we're going to just do a quick little cleanup. Get all that oxidation off. And if you aren't doing this step, I would highly recommend you do it. It's absolutely amazing on how much better your joints are going to turn out. You don't need a lot of solder when you do your track work. And if you are getting a lot of solder on your joints, you need to step back and think about what you're doing. Just make sure that everything is super clean. It has to be shiny. And you need enough heat. So we're going to slide this one right about there. That looks pretty good. We're just going to eyeball this one since we aren't trying to mate ties up to another piece of rail. And I just want that to catch the end of the guardrail just like that. So now we can put some weight on it just to kind of hold things in place. And I'm going to scribe again, just real quick, where the rail is going. And that way I know where to put my flux. So if you plan things out a little bit, think about what you're doing, especially when you're doing something kind of freehand, like what we're doing right now. That certainly helps a whole lot. But I cannot stress enough having good, clean joints. No different than if you are painting a model. You would certainly clean off the model and not touch it with your fingers, and make sure that anything that's on the model is cleaned off. Soldering is just like that. You need to clean everything off. So let's just slide this back in place, just like that. We'll kind of eyeball it. And keep in mind prototype track. There are a lot of variations. So that looks really good. I'm going to throw a 1, 2, 3 block on it just to hold it. And now, actually, I'm going to put another one right here. I cannot tell you enough how much weight makes all the difference. And I just moved it a little bit. So when you're soldering, you don't want anything to move on you because that can create cold solder joints. So that looks pretty good. Take that away so you can see what we're doing. And I'm pleased with that. So what I think I'm going to do is do this middle one first and just kind of do it so it'll tack it in and hold everything in place. And then I know my work isn't going to move on me for the other joints. Just a little swipe of the solder is all that it takes. It does not take a whole lot. So if you have a good clean joint with a lot of heat and flux, that joint will suck up as much solder as you give it. So you don't want to give it too much. I'm going to switch hands here. So the solder is on the inside. Oh yeah, that's looking good. Go back to this hand and put the solder on the inside. So it takes about 2 seconds for that joint to heat up at 85 watts. Does not take much. And that is looking really, really good. So now we're just going to do the last one real quick. There it is. Easy peasy. So on one of them, I just want to do a quick little cleanup with the scribe while I have it in front of me. The solder is still a little warm. That's looking great. Very pleased with that. So now we're going to do this last one and repeat that process. So once we're done with this, we're actually going to solder in the last 4 guardrails. So we're just going to eyeball it a little bit. That looks really good. And then same as before, just do a quick little scribe. Make sure our flux is in the right spot. Then we'll solder up. So hopefully you can see that it's not that hard. Don't be scared. And if you do want to try this, one of the best things you can do is just take some scrap and practice on some scrap. And just like painting, just like weathering, the first time you do something, you don't want to do it on the finished piece. So grab some rail. And if you have our 3-point track gauges, those help immensely as well too. So now we're going to slide this back on and kind of eyeball it on where it needs to go. That looks really good. and add some weight, hold everything in place. Of course, I moved it just a little bit. All right, I'm just going to put a little more flux on this side. I'm going to do the same thing I did before, where I'm going to tack down one of the middle pieces, or I'm sorry, the middle rail, or this rail right here, and that'll kind of hold it in place while I do everything else. That's looking good. And let's hit some power here. That turned out really well. So now we'll come back and do this side. Perfect. Change hands here. Solder from the other side. And I'm doing this so that way where I'm applying solder is on the side that I can see easily. So I'm not reaching over the crossing and trying to solder something I can't see 100%. Where here I can see this just fine. Oh yeah, that looks really good. Take the heat off, and all of those ties that we needed to add are now done. Just going to take the scribe real quick, clean up that joint. Do a little bit on that side. And then we'll take the wire brush, clean it up, and I'll show you what we've done so far. That side's looking fantastic. Very pleased. It's a good night here upstairs in the workshop. So we're just going to take the wire brush, clean off some of that flux, because we need to come back and add some guardrails to this. And I'll hold this up in a second, give everyone a little closer view of what we did, so you can see it. We're just going to clean up this side with the scribe. And I'm only doing this because I'm adding some plastic tie plate detail to this, and I want that to sit up nice and snug next to the rail. Looking really good right here. Then when we're done with this, I'll do this off camera, but I'll wash the whole thing and scrub it down with an old toothbrush with some Dawn dish soap and make sure I get any remaining flux residue off. So here it is. So look right here. I'm doing this backwards here. So we'll try to get that nice and tight so you can kind of see the joints, see how nice and clean everything is. And now we can add the other guardrails. So I already cut the guardrails and test fitted them, so those are all set to go. And the secret to working outside of the fixture is, I just want to point this out. So for this guardrail right here, I actually soldered that while it was still in the fixture, so that's in the right place. So then when I cut the other pieces to go along right in here, everything matches up just fine. So I know everything is going to fit and it's going to work out just fine. So let's take our first two, and you know, these pieces I just cut the other night, and just like the ties, we're just going to clean off any oxidation on the bottom of the rail. Once you start sanding rail with some 400 grit, it's amazing how soft nickel silver is, and it cleans up really nice, really quickly. So now that we're going to solder some rail freehand, I'm going to show you another little trick in doing so. So let's kind of turn things around a little bit and get this back in the frame. So this is what we're going to do right here. We're going to put this rail in place, and I think it'd be best if I do it like this. Then you can see it. I got some tweezers here, and we're just going to test fit this one more time just to make sure that that looks good. I like that. And I did cut another piece, and that's the same size. So we're going to save that one for this one over here. And then this piece, the smaller guardrail, fits right in here like that. So one of the things that we need to do is make sure the rail that we're soldering in, it aligns with everything else. So first things first, we're going to do this long guardrail first. I'm going to take my scribe, and again, I'm just going to mark really quick where the edge of that rail is. So when I put my flux down in just a second, I have an idea. That looks good. So we're just going to pop some flux onto the matching guardrail that's already soldered in place, and then come back and add flux. For every place else. It's looking good. Okay, so here you need a little help. So last video I had this ruler. I bought this at one of the big box stores where it's a thick ruler, and I'm going to use that to align the piece that I need to solder with the rest of the crossing, just like that. So when you add the ruler to it, you can see how quickly things line up. And I have the Optivisor on so I can look at it with some magnification, and it's looking really, really good. I'm very pleased with that. So we're going to put the ruler back in again. And then I'm just going to take a little bit of weight and I want to hold that in place on the end while I check it one more time. You can never check it too many times. Kind of like measure twice, cut once. We're measuring twice and soldering once. So now what I want to do is just tack the end where the point is. I'm just going to put a little bit of solder in there just to hold it in place. And then I'm going to tack one of the ties and use that to hold it in place. So that way I'm not trying to solder everything all at one time. You just kind of break it down into small bite-sized chunks. So I'm just going to hit this tip. There we go, with just a little bit. And we'll come back and add a little bit more in just a little bit. And then this is where that single electrode resistance iron comes in, where I can actually put that inside the guardrail, heat that joint up, just flow a little bit of solder in there, and it's good. So we're just going to double check it real quick. I'm pleased with that. And now we're going to come back and we're going to add, or not add, we're just going to finish soldering the rest of all the joints here. I'm just going to add a little more flux onto this. And then I can come back with great confidence knowing that this isn't going to move on me and it's aligned. There we go. Now we'll go on to the next one. Just like that. Just a little swipe of solder is all you need. That looks good. And you'll notice too with the resistance soldering iron, you don't need to clean the tip. It's more like little spot welding. And that's it. So that's that side. And here is what we just did. And we added that onto it. Whew, that's a little hot still. Now we're going to do the other side and just repeat that same process, and that will be done. Then we just have one other side to do, and then we can call this crossing done. And so what I'm doing now is I'm just scribing the PC tie for where the flux goes. Put a little bit on. And I'm going to kind of do the same thing. I'm just going to tack it down first. Because we aren't soldering with a fixture, there's nothing holding it down. So we're just going to tack it in place and then come back and then finish it up. And I found that's a nice, easy way to make sure that your work is not going to move on you while you do it. So we're going to take the ruler again, and then we're going to use everything else that we've already soldered as a guide, and we're going to push that in place. Just like that. That's looking really nice. Put a little bit of weight on it. And come back and put a little flux on top of it we're just going to tack. We're just going to tack the top of it down and then come back and tack part of the guardrail down and then finish her up. So don't be intimidated if you need to solder something outside of the fixture. If you go slow, you plan your work, everything will go just fine. Okay, so that looks good. Now I'm just going to do the inside. I'm going to put the solder on the inside of the guardrail. That's looking good. Now I'm going to go back. Actually, let's do the end real quick. And then I'll go back and finish up that first joint. Oh, that just looks great. I just touch it and the solder flows all around the rail, completes, kind of goes all around, completes the joint. So now we're going to come back to the inside here. There's a lot of metal going on here, so sometimes that takes a little longer to heat up, but that went pretty well. I'm pleased with that, and there we go. That side is done. So we just, if you're tuning in, we just soldered these guardrails, these two right here, right on, and you can see how nice and clean those joints are, and this is kind of what we're working on right now. So now what we're going to do is just finish up this side right here, and we'll be done. So it's looking pretty good, and this is a fun little project. And part of the reason why I had to do it this way, and if you didn't see the first video, I'm a trolley modeler, and the spacing that we use on the tracks, which is a standard that a group in the East Coast developed, this the parallel track spacing is 3 1/4 inches. And if you go to the NMRA page and you look at what normal track spacing is, it's 4 inches. So because I needed my track spacing so much tighter, I couldn't build the turnouts completely in the fixture and then just hook them together. I kind of built 2/3 of it in the fixture and then made sure that my parallel track was exactly where it needs to be, since this is going to go on a module. There can be no room for error on a module, especially when you're running brass O-scale cars. You don't want them hitting the ground. So we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to do the long one first, and then we'll come back and do the short one. So we're just going to double check it real quick, and that looks, I'm pleased with that. So now, just like before, I'm just going to do a quick scribe. Scribing is one of those little extra steps. Makes life a little bit easier. So now I know where to put the flux. And put some on the edge of that guardrail. Get some on the ties. Okay, that's looking good. So when I place these pieces of rail, I always like using a tweezers. Just helps a whole lot more. That's looking good. Kind of get that in place. And then we're going to do the same thing we did before. Get out your ruler and then use the ruler and the tweezers, and that didn't quite go as planned. I just bump it and it popped right out. Mike Slater, I know you're watching, and don't laugh. I know you are. Okay, that's looking pretty good. So I'm going to put some weight, add the electrode. Or I'm sorry, the alligator clip. I keep calling it the electrode, but it's really the alligator clip. And I'm just going to look at this under the optivisor. We're going to check it one more time. You can never do this enough. Just when you think, there we go. Perfect. Pleased with that. So again, we're just going to put a little bit of weight on that. And I'm going to, I don't have heat applied yet. It's the beauty of a resistance iron. I can use it to hold things in place. Just touch it with a little more flux. And now we're going to add some heat. You know what? I'm actually going to pull that back just a tiny little bit. Now that I'm looking at it through the optivisor, I just want it to come back. There we go. Just a tiny, tiny little bit. That looks good. And that's one of those things that magnification really, really helps when you're doing work like this, where it looks good to the eye, but then once you see it, it's not quite as perfect as what it could be. But now it is. And I just want to make sure that our point lines up. And I'm doing this because eventually this crossing will be in a magazine, and the camera will pick all of it up, and I don't want that. So now I'm just going to check it by eye. That looks really nice. So I'm going to put a weight on it. And of course, when I add the weight, it moves a little bit, so we're going to skip the weight. Check it again. Check it by eye, and that looks good. So what I'm doing is I'm just tacking it down. That looks good. I'm going to come back, tack it down over here. And with that optivisor, you can just see the solder flow underneath. And it's pretty cool when you can watch it do that. I figure as long as I'm down here, let's finish up this end. It flows underneath, really, really nice. Now we're going to go back in, get the inside of this. There we go. I'm just going to put a little more on top since I just tacked it down, and then that will actually flow into the rest of the joint. Oh, that's fantastic. Looking good. And then we can just come right down and we're just going to finish that up. Just a little tiny swipe of solder is all you need. Looks good. So we just finished this piece right here, and now we just need to do this piece, and then this is done. At least soldering is done. And then I'm going to add a bunch of plastic detail to it. Tie plates, bolts, tissue train group makes a lot of cool bolts that you can just super glue right on, and that adds a whole lot of detail to the crossing. So we're just going to throw some flux down. Sometimes these little guardrails, when you're doing them freehand, because they're so small, there's not as much material to kind of hold on to. So you just want to take your time, go slow, get it where it needs to go. And that looks really good. So we're going to add some flux to the top. Actually, I have to realign it real quick since it moved. Not a problem. Easy peasy. And I've said this on my other videos that you always have to watch out on the last one. You're excited to finish, and you don't want to rush it. That looks nice. So now we're going to add some flux to that outside rail. Add a little bit to the top. And I'm just going to tack that in place. So I'm actually holding the tip of the iron on the top of the rail to heat it up. That looks good. Now we're going to come back. I'm going to put some on the inside of this base of the guardrail, and that will hold everything in place. That looks really good. Now I can come back, finish up that other joint. That looks good. And then come back and finish up the one that's closest to the actual angle. We're almost done, so I appreciate everybody hanging out tonight. Hopefully this gives you a little inspiration. And I certainly don't want anyone to think this is hard. Just like anything else, you just got to go slow. You got to practice a little bit, and you'll be fine. So I'm going to just kind of clean up. I kind of float a little bit of solder inside that joint just to make sure that it covered extremely well. So now I can come back with the soldering braid and clean that up, and that'll be really nice. And while I'm at it, let's just clean up a couple little bits. I don't like solder on my rail because, again, you don't think it's a big deal until you see it in a picture. And then when it's in a picture, it stands out, and can't have that. So we're looking pretty good. So our soldering is finished. So what we're going to do now is just kind of clean up the tops of the rails. And you always have to take your time here. You don't want to distort any of the joints that you have, and just kind of take off those high spots. And then what we'll do is we'll come back with some sandpaper and clean it up. That's looking good. We're just gonna clean this up down here. That's looking really nice. And that's all it takes. Don't get too aggressive with the file, because you may do some damage that you can't come back and fix later. So now I'm just going to kind of clean the tops of the rails, get that last remnant of solder off. So you know your joints are nice and flat when you can take some sandpaper and run it across the top and it doesn't snag. If it does snag, that tells you that the rail is not sitting flush on top of the tie, and you probably need to go back and maybe resolder that joint. So now I'm just going to get in here, touch up everything. And then I'm going to show you another little step that you need to do when you're done. So once that's finished, now what I want to do is kind of tune up what we just did. So I'm just going to take my flat needle file, and I'm just going to kind of go along the sides of the rail, and if there's any little bits of solder, or if you pushed your pushed your frog a little bit too far, this will clean it up, then your wheels won't hit it. That looks good. So clean all that up just a little bit on this side. It's amazing. You don't think you need to do it until you do it, and then everything runs so much better. Okay, so we're gonna take the wire brush, clean her up a little bit, and then you can take a look at what we did tonight. So soldering track shouldn't be stressful. If it's stressful for you, something isn't right. And most likely, the materials that you're trying to solder are not clean enough. Because when you have clean materials with some acid-base flux and a nice hot iron, the joint almost literally solders itself. So you always have to apply heat to one side and let the material melt the solder. Don't let the soldering iron melt the solder. That's where you get into trouble. So this is looking really sharp, and I'll hold this up in a second. And we can take a look at what we've done. So I just want to change glasses real quick. Safety glasses are vital. And let's move the camera back up again. Hey everybody, great to see you. Appreciate you sticking with me. So here is what we've finished tonight. Look at that. It's just fantastic. I'm very pleased. You know, look at it that way. Everything lines up this way. And everything lines up nice and smooth that way. So there you go. There's a double crossing. And that was completely made with just using the 45-degree fixture that we had, where I built both of them about 2/3 of the way and then joined them together. So I think that looks pretty sweet. So this is going to go, since we aren't going to do this in the quad crossing, now we can have some fun. And I didn't do the thing that we always have to do, is we need to run the truck through. So the last step of the process, and I just want to get in here with the microphone. There is no wheel drop. It is super smooth. And then this is going to go and create a little junction on the Chicago Northwestern and the North Shore line in Kenosha, Wisconsin. So this is a Walthers building, and it is pretty true to the prototype, just a couple little tweaks and it'll be good. And that'll make a nice little junction. So thanks again, everybody. Appreciate you watching. And this has been another episode of Upstairs in the Workshop, Volume 4. And stay tuned for some more cool stuff. And we hope to do these once probably every 2 weeks, and just show you all the neat stuff that we're working on up here. So have a great night, everyone. And we'll catch you next time on Upstairs in the Workshop.